And the last one, well, that I didn't know actually. It's a pleasure to meet you. It's a pleasure to have you, and thank you very much for having accepted to come. It's Professor Dirk Hoffmann, and he will talk about new ages. He's a specialist of datation for old paintings. Uranium thorium dating reveals Neanderthal cave paintings. That's something extraordinary. So please, thank you again, Dirk, to be here. And we are very anxious to know more about what Neanderthals were able to paint. Thank you.
Well, actually, I thank you for inviting me to this workshop and giving me the opportunity to present work that I've been doing with colleagues over the last 10 years or so. And some of those were published last year, and I'll focus on this. Just on a side note, actually last year there was also a publication on cave paintings in Siberia that placed those in the range of 30,000 years. So there is evidence of human activity that you can find in caves in that area too. So I'll take you to the world of chronology. It's a little bit different from what we've been talking so far here. And it's quite a privilege to work on cave paintings. I mean, everybody probably knows cave paintings. Everybody has opinions on cave paintings. But if you really go into details and look into the literature, it's actually astonishing how little we really know about cave paintings when it comes to evidence, including the important question, how old is a painting, and who is the author, or the artist, or whatever you want to call this. And the question of how old a painting is actually sometimes also linked to authorship. In this case, it's one of the famous bisons from Altamira cave that could be dated by radiocarbon to about 18,000 years. It is located in Spain, and therefore, as we know at the moment, unless we do find evidence for other species, we know that at that time there were only what we call modern humans around in that area, so they must have been the authors. So the question of who did it is sometimes also linked to when did this happen. So there is a little bit of importance to date cave paintings, but this is one of the most difficult archaeological things to date that I came across so far. Still, you would say, well, we know a lot about the history and the age of paintings, but what was done so far is basically assuming ages. So most of the chronology that we know about cave paintings is based on stylistic criteria that have been assigned ages, sometimes based on comparison to mobile art that could be dated elsewhere. And it also assumes that cave paintings became more sophisticated in time. So more simple cave paintings were given older ages. When it comes to more elaborate paintings, they were younger. And if you look at this chart, which is after Leroy Gorin, no cave painting can be older than 30,000 years if you use this. And that was actually the case for a very long time, that all Spanish cave paintings were thought to be no older than 26,000, 27,000 years. However, when radiocarbon dating was then turning to be done via mass spectrometry, so AMS, accelerator mass spectrometry, it was possible to work on very small samples. And that opened up the possibility actually to give dates on cave paintings that were done with organic pigments. So where charcoal was used for painting, and you were given permission to remove a small portion of this from the painting, you could date that pigment. So this was done here for this bison. The black part of the bison is actually made from charcoal. Two things that you need to consider. Of course, you get an age for the charcoal. That is not necessarily the age of the painting. So, for example, if I went into a cave today and some Neolithic hunters were making fire there a few thousand years ago, and I do find a piece of charcoal, take that and put my name on the wall, if you radiocarbon date this, the painting would be a few thousand years old, but it's not. So radiocarbon gives you a maximum age. It cannot be older than the charcoal, but the radiocarbon age is not necessarily the age of painting. But more importantly, you need the organic pigments. And for example, in Spain, over 90% of the paintings are done with inorganic pigments. So with ochre or black is usually manganese, so you can't even use this. So we were left usually with stylistic criteria. And this is where we came into play, because even, I think in the 1980s, there were suggestions that you could actually date calcium carbonate formations that are associated with paintings. At that time, when it was suggested, I think it was Henry Schwartz, the methods needed several grams of calcite to give a date, and you never have this. So only when methods became available that you can work on small samples, we could go and revisit this. And here in this case, you see a painting, and the white dots that you can see on the wall and sometimes also on the red horse are small crusts that formed from water, calcium carbonate, and these can be dated with a uranium-thorium method. Here again, we do not date the pigment or the painting itself, but we do date something that formed after the painting was done. So what we get here is a minimum age. We know the painting was there before the calcite crust formed, but any time can have elapsed between the execution of the painting and then the formation of these crusts afterwards. However, we can go back quite a lot of time, so the limit of the dating method is 500,000 years. For radiocarbon, for instance, you would not really get beyond 45,000 years. So, just for those who are not familiar with this, why does it work? What we use for uranium-thorium dating is actually a difference in chemical behavior of element uranium and thorium. Uranium is present in very small traces in pretty much every stone. And so when water percolates through the ground and gets into caves, it takes uranium with it because it's soluble. But the element thorium is not soluble. It hates to be in solution. You will not find it in drips that enter the cave. So if a stalagmite on the bottom or a straw forms from these waters, it will have some uranium in it, but no thorium, the decay product. But since uranium is radioactive, thorium, the daughter, will build up in time, and we know the half-lives of this process, and from the ratio that we get today in the calcite, we can work out how much time elapsed since this crystal formed. So this is what we do, and you can apply this to all these cave formations that form from water, like stalagmites, stalactites, or these draperies that you find there that look like curtains. But very important, you also find often what we call either cauliflower or corallite formations. This is when very little water gets through cracks, and then on the walls you have these white crusts, only a few millimeters in diameter. You can see there's a cross-section that it actually forms in layers, usually very, very slow. and it forms where you have very little water, so it's not heavy dripping. And that's important because then the art is not washed away, which is also a possibility when you have a wall that gets wet. You can't simply wash away your art. So these kind of formations you often find associated with cave paintings, like here this little horse. It's in the La Pasiega cave in Spain. But you can also find examples like here, where a painting is totally covered by what we would call a flow stone on the wall. And in time, it will probably disappear. There might be many caves with walls where you can't see that there was a painting once. It's been completely covered by layers of carbonate. And what we do is we go in, try to find cave paintings with such crusts, and then we use actually just a scalpel and gently scratch parts of these formations directly into tubes so that we can date them. And this is the most nerve-wracking job that you can imagine, because you're working sometimes on UNESCO protected heritage sites, and we are quite proud that with our methods, we actually never touch the art itself. So like radiocarbon, you would need to remove pigments. We don't touch the art, we just stop before we get to the pigments. So this is what it would look like. This is on this horse that I showed a crust. What you immediately see is it's been exposed, so it's dry. It's not like an active formation. And in most cases, you will find dust on the surface. So we remove this in the first step, and here are the different sampling steps. A is what it looked like before. Then we remove the outer surface with the dust with the scalpel, and then we start collecting the samples. And we always try to get at least 2 or 3 subsamples, because that's quite important to prove that the uranium-thorium method actually works. Just a single date is not enough, so we always want a succession of samples. And most importantly, at some point we need to demonstrate that there is actually pigment under the crust that we sample. So in the last one you see, we can compare to the red area next to the crust. In the center of this crust, we do find the red paint, and then we stop before we really get onto it. But if we didn't find the red or the pigment underlying the crust, then we cannot exclude that it once was on top of the crust and was simply washed away, so then we couldn't use any of these dates. So these are the prerequisites that we need to guarantee that these, or to show that these samples are actually diagnostic for the cave paintings. So that would be a typical sample. As I said, we can now work on relatively small samples. We are now in a range of 5 milligrams. That is less than a grain of rice that we would subsample. And of course, this is then a chemical process where we separate the uranium and the thorium and analyze this on a mass spectrometer, like here the one that we have in Leipzig. So we've been doing this for 10 years or so, and in 2012, first results were published after a first campaign, mostly on Spanish sites. At that time, we were already quite surprised how old some of these minimum ages were. So we had some examples like hand stencils with age older than 25,000 years. We had anthropomorph on a curtain formation that we could bracket between 28 and 34,000 years. And the oldest was on this panel of hands in El Castillo on the right-hand side, where we had a red disc with a minimum age of 40,800 years. So if you put that into context, here's a graph from Jean-Jacques' publication in 2015. We are in Western Europe, and what we give as a minimum age for the art is usually the lower end of our uncertainty range. So the calcite had an age of 41.4 thousand years. We had 600 years uncertainty, so we say, okay, the minimum that we have for the underlying painting is then 40,800, so the mean age minus our uncertainty. This is because most people forget about uncertainties. We incorporate this in what we provide as minimum age. And this is exactly at the time when modern humans arrived in the area, but Neanderthals were still around. And that raised quite a discussion. I mostly stayed out of that. But we continued to work on this anyway. And one thing that I found critical on this, on our first work, was that due to we were in a learning process, we didn't really know how much sample we could sample, so how the sample sizes, and in most cases we had single samples for crusts. So you could not demonstrate that they are 100% reliable with just one date. So what we did is we went back to some of the samples that we already did, like here on this red triangle. On the right-hand side, there is a crust that was sampled with a single date for our first publication. We went back to this, there was enough left, and did studies. On the left-hand side is the mean age that we took on 70 milligrams in the first round. It was an age of 18,500 years. And you can see then next to this, we really went through from top towards the pigment and did individual dates on much smaller samples. And you can see that what we got on the first round is the mean of the distribution that we have, and when we get close to the pigment, it's actually minimum age of 24,000 years. So this is the kind of work that we are doing, and this demonstrates that these crusts are well behaved, so they are not disturbed, no open system, and that the results are reliable. We went back to the panel of hands where we had the oldest dates, and we were doing the same exercise on many others. There are lots of these small cauliflower crusts, and we have now, it's not yet published, these are 10 new minimum ages. The first two are from the first publication, including the one with 40,800 years minimum. You can see that the crusts on this panel formed all between 34,000 and 41,000 years. So we do not have another crust that age, but generally speaking, we can constrain the phase when there was little water coming through this panel and formed all the crusts that you find there. So now I'm going on to the more exciting results that we were publishing last year. They are from 3 different sites in Spain. On the first publication in 2012, we had, I think, a total of 55 uranium-thorium dates on crusts. We are now reaching, I think, 500 and something individual dates. So you need to be very patient. And we were focusing on art or paintings that are considered to be more symbolic, so hand stencils, dots, lines, not so much on figurative art. So here's an impression of La Pasiega in the north. So I kept this in to give you an idea about the size of the painting. That's important, and I'm talking about these red lines that you can see, the lights pointing on this. It looks a little bit like squares, but you can see it's part of a panel where there are plenty of paintings. You see all these white dots are these calcite precipitates. They are sometimes on top of the paintings, like these red dots. There's the little horse that I've been showing, or the triangle. So from all these other motifs that we were working on, we know that these crusts are well behaved. So we then inspect them in the cave with microscope. We check with scalpel whether the texture is okay before we start sampling directly into tubes. So this is here on this, what it's called La Trampa, in the first description in almost 100 years ago. Why La Trampa? If you look here, this is the whole example of the panel with the painting that we were just looking at. If we go in, and I now tweak the colors a little bit with the software, you may see that there are actually animals inside these rectangles. There's a front of a bovid in the bottom, and in the top square there's the back of what is probably a pig. Nobody really knows, but the first person to describe thought this was a trap. That's why it's called La Trampa. We could not confirm a superimposition between these animals and the lines. So our dating strictly now applies to the red line. So here in this part we found that crust, which we sampled. Here you can see in the center the red color appearing. That's when we stopped. And we got 3 subsamples from that. And the one closest to the pigment yielded an age that it's older than 64,800,000 years. So that was example number 1. We were quite excited, but we knew it's going to be difficult to convince people. And when we were thinking how to publish this, we actually got the next result in that also yielded quite an old age. So we decided, okay, let's wait with publication and see whether we can confirm this and do this exercise. So what are you looking at here? This is actually an overhang in a cave in Cáceres. It's called Maltravieso. And we are lying on the ground looking up underneath this overhang, and on the side you can see the stalactites coming down from the top. So you're really looking up onto underneath. There's about a meter high height between the ground and this. And now you probably say, well, what is this about? Now I tweak the color again. And maybe now you can see, I don't really have a pointer here that works, but you should be able to see, no, I can't see, 3 hands. One at the top left, 1 and 2 in the center. So one's facing, pointing down, and the other one is pointing to the right. So I'm now going to zoom in into the one that's in the middle. So this is how the wall looks again. And I tweak the color, and here you can hopefully see that it is a hand stencil. And this is made by putting your hand on the wall and then either blowing or throwing color, pigment over your hand. You remove your hand and you have this negative. So this really needs some planning. This cannot be done accidentally. And here we also, if you go back, this is actually almost completely covered with calcite. Good for us. This is why it's hard to see. So we removed calcite there, and this hand stencil is older than 66,700 years. So, and then when we got that, actually we had the third example. Here's now in southern Spain. It's Ardales. This is a big boss with lots of kind of curtain formations, and this is the size. So 2 of my colleagues sitting there, and actually in this cave there are also some excavations going on by the Neanderthal Museum. which is very nice, so we can link our results to that. And because it is so difficult to see in all our pictures that we provide for the publication, I just show some film, because you can see that there is this red paint in the niches. And actually all of these niches have some of this red paint. You cannot find this ochre naturally in the cave. And if you look here, you can even see the splashes in the back when someone put this pigment in. So this, I put this in because of the last line of defense of some people not liking our results. They always say, oh, this could be natural, or this could be accidental, that someone just rubbed the body with paint on the formations and left some paint behind. This is done intentionally. So you cannot get the paint into these niches without wanting to do this. Good for us is that actually these formations continued to form after the paint was put in. And in terms of uranium-thorium dating, this is one of the best material that you could find associated with cave paintings, because this is really like a stalagmite or stalactite. It's not like these very thin crusts. This is not even prone to be open system. And here we had to remove quite a bit, but we did find the painting under the formation. And again, we have an age that's older than 65,500 years. So we have 3 examples now spread over Spain that show that cave paintings are older than 60,000 years. And for me, the astonishing thing was really that cave paintings can survive that long. I mean, that's for me just amazing. Now here that the dots or so are, well, there's a discussion, does this qualify as art or whatever? This is actually something that you find frequently in caves, and it's been done like here in southern France. The only example where we could do some work in France, we had initial results of over 76,000 years for that. But this is an example where we would need to go back and confirm results because it's a single date. But this was our very first example that we had, but we were never given permission to get back into this and to confirm this. Otherwise, France would be leading with the oldest cave paintings again. But also in the northern Spain, you also find galleries of dots. Here for this, we have a minimum age of 38,000 years. So there's something that you find all over many, many caves. We don't know what it is, whether there is a meaning. We will never be able to understand this. I don't think we'll find a Rosetta Stone to understand what it means. But what we know now, it's been done at least 65,000 years ago in Spain. There are 3 examples now, and that cave paintings have been done prior to 64,000 years. And going with current evidence that we know about Europe at the moment, and I always go with the one that's the simplest, those cannot be modern humans as far as we know. They have not arrived at that time unless we do find evidence for that. And we know at the time Neanderthals were around. Of course, you can also say it could be Erectus or whatever, but let's stick with the closest cousin. So we think that we have evidence that Neanderthals were actually active and going into deep caves, bringing pigments, putting hand stencils, red dots, or just simple lines on the wall. They were not the only ones doing this. Hand stencils are also known to, for instance, here in Sulawesi. So the question, who did what? I mean, Neanderthals went into caves, but modern humans did the same. So what's new is now it's not just modern humans, as that was probably what some people were really surprised that also Neanderthals did this kind of behavior. So, bottom line, who did what? Neanderthals and modern humans were active in caves. And I just want to introduce you. I've not done this alone. So the key players that are on the team are here: Marcos Garcia-Diaz, Alistair Pike, João Zilao, and two colleagues that were not on this trip in Limervey, Paul Pettit and Chris Standish. And I want to stress out that we always work with our local experts. So in this case, it was Michel Blanchet, for me, one of the persons in the world when it comes to cave paintings. It's quite an honor to work with him. So whenever we go into caves, it's not that we just go in and hijack the place and sample. So we work with the local scientists. So I thank you for your attention, and happy to answer questions.